In 1925, the US Navy existed in something of a paradox when it came to aircraft carriers. On the one hand, it had two of the largest and arguably the best carriers for the period under conversion-construction. On the other hand, their actual practical experience operating carriers was limited to a few trials and exercises using the much smaller converted Collier Langley. So when, in that year, it was decided to start work on the next generation of US carriers, and their first purpose-built vessel of this type, the work was far more heavily influenced by theory than it would be by experience. The first thing they had to account for was that the new ship, or ships, could not be more copies of the Lexingtons. Those ships occupied a special displacement niche carved out for them in the Washington Naval Treaty, which the US Navy knew in private they'd also significantly exceeded, and the same treaty limited any new carrier construction to 27,000 tons per ship, and 135,000 tons total for all carriers combined. Once you'd removed the tonnage of the carriers the US Navy already had, either in service or under construction, the remaining tonnage meant that it was possible to build 3 relatively large carriers, 4 slightly smaller ones, or 5 even smaller hulls, with these latter ones coming in at only about 60% of the displacement of the biggest design. Having considered the capabilities of sketch designs for all 3 types, the US Navy noted that the total aircraft capacity of the 5 smaller hulls put together exceeded that of the other 2 types, and they also believed that individual hull losses were very likely to occur, and so they opted to move forward with a design based on the smallest hull, which was a notional 13,800-ton standard displacement. Much emphasis was placed on getting the maximum number of aircraft possible at the expense of almost everything else. Given that they didn't think it was going to survive very long anyway, it probably makes sense. This meant, amongst other things, accepting a somewhat smaller power plant and thus lower than ideal top speed, a flush deck design at least to start with, no anti-surface guns unlike the Lexingtons, and a very lightweight flight deck. Also included were a series of small outriggers that allowed aircraft to be stored on the flight deck with only their front landing gear actually on the deck, the tail wheel and much of the length of the fuselage projected out over the ocean attached to said outrigger. In theory, the ship's operational flight group should be about the same as the Lexingtons, despite being only half the displacement. Naturally, some design changes had to be made as experience from operating the Lexingtons themselves began to come in, and displacement crept upwards somewhat, with the ship eventually coming in at about 14,500 tons standard displacement. Named USS Ranger, the new vessel was laid down in September 1931, launched in February 1933, and commissioned into the fleet in June 1934. She could make just over 29 knots using 53,500 shaft horsepower that drove a pair of screws, with an anti-aircraft only gun battery of 8 single 5-inch 25 caliber heavy anti-aircraft guns and a large number of 50 caliber machine guns. Armour was exceptionally limited, a 2-inch belt that might just about keep out destroyer caliber guns at range, and a small area of 1-inch deck armour aft. In exchange for some of these compromises, she could indeed carry over 70 aircraft, exact numbers depending on the balance struck between fighters and dive bombers, since as built she did not have the facilities to carry torpedoes or torpedo bombers. She also ended up entering service with an island. This was a very late change that caused her somewhat unique funnel arrangements. As a flush deck design, the power plant had been moved aft and the funnels placed either side of the flight deck in that location, with the ability to hinge over 90 degrees for flight ops to clear the flight deck of smoke and obstacles. The change to an island had been far too late to relocate the entire machinery plant with a funnel behind the island, and so she retained the movable stacks instead. Entering service, Ranger took part in numerous fleet exercises, but as war beckoned, she received a number of upgrades, including a basic radar, improved light anti-aircraft guns, and authorization to make the needed changes to embark and utilize torpedo bombers. The outbreak of war found her on the US East Coast, but after an evaluation of her capabilities and vulnerabilities, it was considered unwise to send her into the Pacific, where much larger and better protected carriers were being lost at an alarming rate. Instead, she would remain in and around the European theatre, initially as a large and effective aircraft ferry, able to send half a dozen squadrons worth of aircraft to reinforce Allied positions in North Africa with each run. In November 1942, though, she was able to take part in active combat operations, leading the 4 smaller Sangamon-class escort carriers in covering and supporting the Allied landings of Operation Torch. Her aircraft suppressed Vichy air efforts, and her bombers inflicted significant damage on the partially completed battleship Jean Bart, as well as attacking and damaging a variety of other warship and ground targets in exchange for the total or constructive loss of 16 aircraft. Then it was back to ferrying aircraft for a bit before she headed north to join up with the British Home Fleet, and start on a series of missions attacking German assets in and around Norway. This continued for much of 1943, but by 1944 so many new carriers were flying Allied flags that Ranger became a training ship, with occasional runs ferrying aircraft and personnel around, at least for the first few months. A late spring refit saw her change roles again. She was now a night flight training carrier, finally sent to the Pacific, although only operating her training missions in a radius around Pearl Harbor. This continued until the autumn, when she went back to more regular training roles and was relocated to the US West Coast. After the war, there was a bit of confusion about what to do with her, but within a year, with so many Essex-class to hand, the US Navy decided to scrap her, with the ship being decommissioned in October 1946 and going to the breakers 3 months later.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.